You don't lose control all at once. It happens in fragments. Small, almost invisible moments that feel justified at the time. An email lands in your inbox late in the afternoon. You are already mentally drained. The message is short, slightly sharp in tone. You read it once, then again. Something about it feels off, disrespectful. Maybe. You don't pause. You don't question your state. You start typing immediately. Your fingers move faster than you're thinking. You press send. 10 minutes later, the clarity arrives. You reread what you wrote and feel that quiet drop in your stomach. It wasn't necessary. It wasn't strategic. It was emotional. But now it's out there. Permanent. This is how reputations erode. Not through major failures, but through small, unmanaged reactions repeated over time. Or consider a different moment. You're at home. Someone close to you says something that lands wrong. Maybe it's a criticism. Maybe it's just poorly worded. But your brain doesn't interpret it as neutral. It feels like an attack. You respond quickly, defensively. Your tone sharpens. The conversation escalates. Now it's no longer about the original issue. It becomes about who is right, who is respected, who is being heard. Later that night, the house is quiet, but the tension remains. You replay the conversation in your head. You think of better things you could have said. Or worse, you justify what you said to protect your pride. Either way, nothing improved. Something was damaged. Think about that. Most people don't walk through life making catastrophic decisions. They walk through life reacting. Constantly. Subtly. Automatically. And it's exhausting. There's a specific kind of fatigue that comes from this. Not physical tiredness. Not even the kind that sleep fixes. It's cognitive fatigue. Emotional residue. The weight of unfinished loops in your mind. You wake up already slightly tense. You check your phone before your feet hit the ground. Messages. Notifications. Demands. By the time your day begins, your nervous system is already activated, already scanning for friction. Then the day unfolds in fragments. You try to focus on something meaningful, but your attention keeps breaking. A message pulls you away. A memory of a conversation replays. You draft a response in your head while pretending to work. You switch tasks, not because it's necessary, but because your mind is restless. Let me ask you something. When was the last time you made it through an entire day without feeling internally pulled in multiple directions? Most people can't remember, and this is where it becomes dangerous. Because the more overstimulated you are, the lower your threshold for emotional reaction becomes. Small things start to feel big. Neutral comments start to feel personal. Delays feel like disrespect. Silence feels like judgment. Your internal world becomes loud, reactive, unstable. And yet, from the outside, everything can look fine. You're functioning. You're working. You're responding. You're handling responsibilities. But internally, there is constant friction. Constant microreactions that never fully resolve. Here's a simple, familiar scene. You pick up your phone just for a second after something irritates you. Maybe you scroll to distract yourself. Maybe you check a message. 1 minute turns into 10. 10 turns into 45. You don't even remember what you were looking for. But the original emotion is still there, just buried under noise. Now you're not only irritated, you're also drained and behind on what actually mattered. This is the invisible tax. Emotional reactivity doesn't just affect your relationships. It fragments your attention. It weakens your decisions. It slowly conditions you to live in a constant state of low-grade agitation. And over time, you begin to accept this as normal. You start to believe that being easily triggered is just part of being human, that speaking in anger is honest, that reacting quickly is a sign of strength. It's not. It's a lack of control disguised as authenticity. Let me ask you another question. How many of your recent problems were caused not by the situation itself, but by how you responded to it? If you're honest, the number is not small, because most of the damage in adult life doesn't come from external chaos. It comes from internal mismanagement. A 5-second reaction can override 5 years of trust. A single message sent at the wrong emotional state can close doors you didn't even know were open. A moment of ego can cost you long-term peace. And the most uncomfortable part is this. You often see it clearly, but only after it's too late. That gap between stimulus and awareness is where your life is quietly shaped. Right now, for most people, that gap is almost non-existent. Trigger. Reaction. Regret. Fast. Automatic. Predictable. But there's another way to live. A way that doesn't require you to suppress emotion, but to master the space around it. Because everything changes the moment you stop reacting instantly. And very few people ever learn how to do that. The real problem is not your temper. It is not your personality. It is not even your stress. The real problem is that your brain has been trained to react before it understands. And most people never question this, because the reaction feels justified in the moment. You feel disrespected, so you respond. You feel attacked, so you defend. You feel misunderstood, so you explain quickly, forcefully, emotionally. It feels natural. It feels honest. It even feels necessary. But what feels natural is often just what has been reinforced. Let's dismantle a belief that has been repeated for decades, that venting is healthy. You've heard this before. Let it out. Say what you feel. Don't bottle things up. It sounds reasonable. It sounds therapeutic. But in practice, uncontrolled venting does something very different. It strengthens the exact neural pathways that make you reactive. Every time you explode, even slightly, your brain learns a pattern. Emotional discomfort arises. Expression follows. Temporary relief is achieved. That relief is important because your brain is constantly tracking reward. And here's where the trap forms. When you react impulsively, raise your voice, fire off a message, make a sharp comment, you often feel a brief sense of release, a discharge, a moment where the internal pressure drops. Your brain records that, not as a mistake, as a solution. So the next time you feel that same internal tension, it pushes you toward the same behavior, faster this time, with less resistance. This is not weakness. This is conditioning. Now layer in what is happening biologically. When someone says something that challenges you, your competence, your authority, your identity, Your brain does not process it as a casual social event. The amygdala, which is responsible for threat detection, flags it as danger, not metaphorically, literally. It doesn't distinguish well between a physical threat and a social one. To your nervous system, being disrespected can feel dangerously close to being attacked. So it triggers a cascade. Cortisol and adrenaline are released into your bloodstream. Your heart rate increases. Your breathing becomes shallow. Your muscles tighten. And most importantly, your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for logic, planning, and restraint, begins to go offline. This is what psychologists call an amygdala hijack. In that moment, you are not operating as your highest self. You are operating as a survival system. Think about that. You are trying to solve a professional or relational problem with a brain that believes it is under attack. What kind of decisions do you think come from that state? Let me give you a simple, familiar example. You're in a meeting. Someone questions your approach. Not aggressively, just directly. But your body doesn't wait for interpretation. It reacts instantly. Heat rises in your chest. Your jaw tightens. Your mind starts generating counterarguments at high speed. You interrupt. You defend. Your tone sharpens just enough to shift the room. And in that moment, you believe you are protecting your position. But what you are actually doing is revealing instability. Later, when the emotional wave passes, you may realize the feedback had value, or at the very least, it didn't require that level of intensity. But the damage is already done. Not dramatic, not catastrophic. Just a subtle shift in how others perceive you. Less composed, less strategic, more reactive. This is how opportunities quietly disappear. Not because you lack skill, but because you lack emotional regulation under pressure. Let me ask you something. In the moments where you react the fastest, are those the moments where you are thinking the clearest? Or are those the moments where you are trying to escape discomfort as quickly as possible? Because that is what most reactions are. They are not solutions. They are exits. Fast exits from internal tension. And here is where dopamine enters the picture. Dopamine is often misunderstood as a pleasure chemical. It is more accurately a motivation and reinforcement signal. It tells your brain this behavior matters. Remember this. When you react and feel that brief sense of release, dopamine reinforces a loop. Trigger discomfort reaction relief. Over time, this loop becomes automatic. You don't choose to react. You are pulled into it. And the more often it happens, the less space exists between trigger and response. Eventually, that space disappears almost entirely. This is why highly reactive people often say, "That's just how I am." What they are really describing is a deeply ingrained neural pathway, not identity, conditioning. Now consider the long-term effect of this. If every challenge feels like a threat, and every threat demands an immediate response, your nervous system never truly rests. You live in a state of low-grade vigilance. Always scanning. Always interpreting. Always slightly on edge. This is exhausting. Not in a dramatic way. In a slow, cumulative way that erodes your clarity, your patience, and your ability to think long-term. And most people try to solve this with more expression, more explanation, more reaction, which only feeds the system further. Let me ask you a harder question. What if the problem is not that you feel too much, but that you act too quickly on what you feel? Because emotion itself is not the enemy. Emotion is data. But when data is processed without space, without interpretation, without control, it becomes noise. And noise, repeated over time, becomes your default state. This is the hidden problem. Not anger, not stress, but the absence of a pause long enough for intelligence to re-enter the room. Until that pause exists, your knowledge, your experience, your intentions, they are all secondary. Because in the moments that matter most, the system that decides your behavior is not your wisdom. It is your wiring. And unless that wiring is interrupted, it will continue to run the same pattern again and again with predictable results. Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in prison. That fact alone is often repeated, but rarely understood at a behavioral level. Because what matters is not just the duration. It is the psychological environment he was forced to live inside. Constant surveillance, systematic humiliation, limited control over even the smallest aspects of daily life, and perhaps most importantly, continuous exposure to people whose explicit role was to dominate, provoke, and diminish him. If there was ever a context designed to justify anger, it was that one. And yet, Mandela made a decision early on that would define not just his survival, but his power. He refused to become emotionally predictable. Think about that. In a place where he had almost no external control, he focused entirely on internal control, not as a passive coping mechanism, but as a strategic advantage, because he understood something most people never fully grasp. If someone can reliably provoke you, they can control you. In prison, this is not philosophical. It is practical. A guard who can trigger your anger can dictate your behavior. They can escalate your punishment. They can isolate you. They can reduce your options. But a man who does not react becomes difficult to manipulate. Mandela observed this closely. Instead of reacting to every insult, every act of disrespect, he began to study the people around him. He watched how guards behaved. He learned their language. Literally, he learned Afrikaans, the language of his captors. Now pause for a moment and consider the discipline behind that decision. He did not learn their language out of submission. He learned it to understand them, to remove emotional distance, to gain insight into how they thought. While others reacted, he gathered information. While others expressed anger, he conserved energy. While others fought emotionally, he positioned himself strategically. This is the power of the pause in its highest form. Not silence as weakness, but silence as control. There is a story often referenced from his time on Robben Island. Mandela would engage guards in calm, measured conversation, not confrontational, not submissive, just composed. Over time, something shifted. The guards, who were used to resistance in the form of anger, began to lose their psychological leverage because their usual tools no longer worked. They could not provoke him easily. They could not predict him. And without that predictability, their control weakened. This is subtle, but critical. Power is not just about force. It is about influence over behavior. Mandela, through discipline alone, began to influence the emotional climate around him, and eventually, that composure extended beyond survival. It became leadership. Other prisoners looked to him not because he reacted the strongest, but because he remained the most stable. He became a reference point, a center, and when the time came for negotiation, for actual political transition, that same discipline became decisive. He was able to sit across from the very system that imprisoned him and engage without emotional volatility, not because he had no anger, but because he had complete authority over when and if that anger would be expressed. Let me ask you something. What would your life look like if your reactions were no longer predictable? If people could not easily trigger you, how would that change your position at work, in your relationships, in moments of conflict? Because predictability is vulnerability. Most people believe strength is about expressing what they feel immediately and fully. Mandela demonstrated the opposite. Strength is the ability to feel everything and choose precisely what to do with it. There's another layer here that is often missed. Emotional discipline is not suppression. It is transformation. Mandela did not eliminate anger. That would be unrealistic. Instead, he redirected it. He used it as information, as fuel, as a signal of what mattered. But he refused to let it dictate his behavior in real time. This distinction is everything. Because when emotion dictates action, you become reactive. When emotion informs action, you become strategic. And that shift only happens in one place, the pause, that space between stimulus and response where most people collapse, and where a few individuals build control. Mandela expanded that space deliberately over years under extreme conditions. You are not in a prison cell, but you are still exposed to daily provocations. Emails, conversations, subtle challenges to your identity and competence. And in those moments, the same principle applies. Every time you react instantly, you give away control. Every time you pause, even briefly, you reclaim it. Mandela's environment was extreme. Yours is not, which makes the real question uncomfortable. If he could develop that level of composure under those conditions, what is preventing you from developing a fraction of it in your own life? Think about that carefully. Because the difference between reacting and responding is not personality. It is training. And the pause is where that training begins. There's a system running beneath your awareness. You don't see it. You don't consciously choose it. But it is shaping your behavior in real time, especially in the moments that matter most. And once you see it clearly, you will start to recognize just how much of your life is being governed by it. It begins with something small, a tone in someone's voice, a delayed reply, a short sentence in an email, a look that you interpret as dismissive. This is the trigger. The trigger itself is often neutral, or at least ambiguous. But your brain does not treat ambiguity as neutral. It tries to resolve it instantly. It scans for meaning, for threat, for implication. And because your brain is optimized for survival, not accuracy, it leans negative. So the interpretation forms quickly. This is disrespect. This is criticism. This is a challenge to my competence. Now the second phase begins. Craving. Not in the way most people think of craving, like wanting food or pleasure. This is a psychological craving, a need to restore internal balance, to correct a perceived threat. If your identity feels challenged, your system pushes you toward protection. You feel the urge to respond, to clarify, to defend, to reassert control. And here is where most people believe they are making a conscious choice. They are not. They are following a conditioned impulse. Let me ask you something. When you feel that sudden urge to respond, immediately, does it feel optional? Or does it feel almost compulsory? That pressure, that internal urgency, is the craving stage of the loop. Now comes the response. You reply to the message. You interrupt in the conversation. You raise your tone slightly. You add emphasis, maybe even sarcasm. It doesn't have to be extreme. In fact, most of the time, it isn't. It's subtle, just enough to shift the emotional temperature of the interaction. And in that moment, something happens internally. Relief. The tension drops. Slightly, but noticeably. You said something. You acted. You didn't just sit there. That relief is a reward. And your brain pays very close attention to rewards, because rewards are how it learns what to repeat. So the loop completes. Trigger, craving, response, reward. And then comes the most important phase. The one most people never notice. Reinforcement. Your brain encodes the entire sequence. Not as a conscious lesson, but as a pattern. Next time a similar trigger appears, the pathway activates faster, with less friction, less hesitation. Over time, the gap between trigger and response shrinks. Eventually, it disappears. This is how reactivity becomes identity. People say, "That's just how I am." But what they are actually describing is a loop that has been reinforced thousands of times. Now layer ego on top of this system. The human brain is deeply invested in maintaining a stable sense of self. Your beliefs about who you are, competent, respected, intelligent, are not just ideas. They are protected structures. So when something threatens that structure, even slightly, the brain reacts as if something valuable is at risk, because something is, your identity, and the brain treats identity threats with surprising intensity. A simple comment like, "I think there's a better way to do this," can be processed not as collaboration, but as invalidation. Not because it is objectively threatening, but because it touches something internally. So the system activates. Trigger. Craving. Response. Reward. But now it is amplified, because you are not just reacting to the present moment. You are reacting to what it represents. Status. Respect. Control. Think about how often this happens in your day. A message that feels slightly dismissive. A colleague who doesn't acknowledge your input. A family member who questions your decision. Individually, these are small, but the system does not treat them as small. It accumulates them. And here is where it becomes dangerous. Because the more frequently this loop runs, the more sensitive it becomes. Your threshold lowers. Things that would not have bothered you a year ago now trigger a response. Your baseline shifts. You become easier to provoke, more reactive, more vigilant, more emotionally taxed. And yet, from your perspective, it still feels justified, because each individual reaction makes sense in isolation. This is illusion. You are not evaluating each moment independently. You are operating from a system that has been gradually tuned toward reactivity. Let me ask you a harder question. How many of your reactions today were actually necessary, not justified? Necessary. There is a difference. Justification looks backward. It explains why something happened. Necessity looks forward. It asks whether that reaction improved anything. Most reactions fail that test. They don't improve clarity. They don't strengthen relationships. They don't increase respect. They simply release tension. And then they create new problems to manage. Now consider the long-term effect of living inside the system. You begin to experience life as something that is constantly happening to you. People say things. Situations arise. You react. Again and again. There is very little sense of authorship. Very little sense of control. Because control does not exist in the reaction. It exists in the space before it. And if that space is missing, the system runs uninterrupted. This is why so many people feel exhausted without understanding why. It's not just the workload. It's the constant activation of this loop. Dozens of times a day. Small triggers. Small reactions. Small rewards. Accumulating into a state of chronic tension. Your nervous system never fully resets. Your attention remains fragmented. Your emotional baseline remains unstable. And over time, this becomes your normal. But it is not neutral. It is a trained state, a conditioned pattern that can be observed, interrupted, and rebuilt. The key is not to eliminate triggers. That's impossible. The key is to break the automatic sequence, to insert something that does not currently exist for most people. A deliberate interruption, a pause long enough to disrupt the loop before it completes. Because once the response happens, the reward follows. And once the reward follows, the pattern strengthens. So the only place to intervene is before the response, inside that narrow window where awareness can override impulse. Right now, for most people, that window is almost invisible, but it can be expanded, trained, strengthened, and once it is, the entire system begins to change. Not overnight, not perfectly, but measurably. Because the moment you stop completing the loop, you stop reinforcing it. And the moment you stop reinforcing it, you begin to take your behavior back from the system that has been running it for years. At this point, you have two options. You can keep listening, nodding along, recognizing yourself in these patterns, and then return to the same automatic reactions the moment this video ends. Or you can make a decision right now that the next trigger you experience will not control you. Because understanding this system is not the same as interrupting it. Let me ask you something. The next time someone challenges you, ignores you, or says something that feels slightly off, will you even notice the moment before you react? Or will it happen the way it always does? Fast, justified, and automatic? This is where most people fail. Not because they lack intelligence, but because they never convert awareness into action. So decide now. Not later. Not when it happens. Now. The next trigger, will you pause? Or will you repeat the same pattern you already understand is costing you control? What you need is not more awareness. You already understand the problem. What you need is a system that functions under pressure, when your heart rate is elevated, when your ego is activated, when your instincts are telling you to react immediately, because that is where most frameworks fail. They sound intelligent in calm moments, but collapse in real ones. So this is not a philosophy. This is a protocol. Something you can execute in real time, under emotional load, without needing perfect conditions. I call it the strategic delay protocol, and it begins earlier than you think. The first step is not control. It is detection. Most people miss the moment entirely. By the time they realize they are emotional, they have already reacted. The email is sent. The tone has shifted. The damage is done. So your first task is to recognize the signal. Not the thought. The body. Your body always reacts before your mind catches up. A slight tightening in your chest. Heat in your face. A subtle increase in heart rate. The impulse to interrupt. The urge to respond immediately. That is the moment, not later. Right there. You are not yet reacting, but you are about to, and this is where you insert awareness. You don't need a long internal speech. You don't need to analyze the situation. You simply need to notice. This is activation. That single recognition does something critical. It begins to re-engage your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that was about to go offline. Most people skip this. They wait until the emotion is overwhelming, then try to control it. That is too late. You are not trying to stop the wave at its peak. You are catching it as it begins to rise. The second step is physical interruption. Not mental. Physical. Because in that moment, your body is driving the experience. So you shift the body first. You pause. Not symbolically. Literally. You stop speaking. You stop typing. You create stillness. And then you breathe. Slow inhale through the nose. Longer exhale through the mouth. Again. And again. You are not doing this to relax. You are doing this to regulate. Longer exhales activate the parasympathetic nervous system. They begin to lower cortisol. They reduce the intensity of the emotional spike. This is measurable biology, not self-help language. 10 seconds. That's all. But those 10 seconds are the difference between reaction and control. Now, this will feel uncomfortable. Your mind will push back. It will say, respond now. Don't let this sit. Say something. That urgency is the system trying to complete the loop. You do not obey it. You stay in the pause. The third step is labeling. Simple, direct, precise. You identify what is happening internally. This is anger. This is defensiveness. This is ego. You are not judging it. You are naming it. And this matters more than it seems. Because when you label an emotion, you create separation from it. You are no longer inside the emotion. You are observing it. Neuroscience shows that this process, affect labeling, reduces activity in the amygdala. It weakens the intensity of the emotional response. But only if it is honest. Not I'm fine. Not this doesn't bother me. Clear recognition. This is frustration. And once it is named, it becomes manageable. Now we move to the step most people resist. Strategic delay. This is where discipline becomes visible. If a situation is written, email, message, any form of text, you do not respond immediately. You write the response if you need to, but you do not send it. You wait. Minimum, a few hours. Ideal, 24 hours. This is not avoidance. This is optimization. Because emotional clarity improves with time. What feels urgent in the moment often becomes irrelevant by the next day. Let me give you a simple scenario. You receive a message that feels dismissive. You draft a sharp reply. It feels justified. It feels necessary. But instead of sending it, you close it. The next morning, you read it again, and something shifts. The tone feels excessive. The point feels less important. You see alternatives that were invisible the day before. This is what time does. It restores access to your full cognitive capacity. Now, many people resist this step because they equate speed with competence. They believe that responding quickly shows control. It doesn't. It shows reactivity. True control is the ability to choose timing. And sometimes, the most powerful response is delayed. Next comes reframing. This is where you correct the distortion your brain created at the beginning. Remember, your brain interpreted the trigger as a threat. Now you question that interpretation. You ask, is this actually a threat or just discomfort? Will this matter in a week? Am I protecting something real or just my ego? These questions are not philosophical. They are corrective. They pull you out of survival mode and back into perspective. Because most of what you react to is not dangerous. It is inconvenient. It is uncomfortable. It challenges your identity. But it does not require immediate defense. And when you see that clearly, your need to react decreases. Now you choose a response. And here is where most people overcomplicate things. They believe they must say something, explain something, assert something. You don't. You have options. Silence. A short, neutral response. A question instead of a statement. Or no response at all. Control is not expressed through volume or speed. It is expressed through precision. You say only what improves the situation. Nothing more. Nothing reactive. And if nothing improves the situation, you say nothing. This is difficult at first, because your ego wants expression. But your objective is not expression. It is outcome. The final step is reflection. After the moment has passed, you review it, not emotionally, structurally. What was the trigger? What did you feel? What did you almost react? What did you do instead? And what was the result? This is how you rewire the system. Because your brain learns from repetition. Every time you interrupt the loop, you weaken the old pattern. Every time you complete the loop, you reinforce it. There is no neutral. You are either training reactivity or training control. Let me ask you something. How many times today will you have the opportunity to practice this? More than you think. A message, a comment, a delay, a tone, small moments. And that is where this protocol lives. Not in extreme situations. In ordinary ones. Because if you can master the small triggers, the larger ones lose their power. This is not about becoming emotionless. It is about becoming deliberate. You will still feel anger, frustration, defensiveness. But those feelings will no longer dictate your behavior. They will inform it. And that is a completely different way of living. Slower on the surface, but far more controlled underneath. And over time, something changes. The gap between trigger and response expands. The urgency fades. The need to react weakens. And in its place, something rare begins to form. Composure, not as a personality trait, but as a trained capability, built one pause at a time. Slow down for a moment, because this is the part most people avoid. Not the strategy, not the technique, but the confrontation with themselves. You now understand the mechanism. You see the pattern. You can even imagine yourself applying the pause. But beneath all of that, there is a deeper question. Why haven't you done it already? Not intellectually, but consistently. Let me ask you something, and answer it without protecting your image. Why do you hand remote control of your emotional state to people you do not even respect? Think about that carefully. A comment from someone you wouldn't trade lives with can alter your mood for hours, sometimes for an entire day. A tone and a message can pull you out of focus, out of presence, out of control. Why? Is it really about what they said? Or is it about what it touched inside you? Because most reactions are not about the present moment. They are about identity. The need to be seen a certain way. Competent. Respected. In control. Intelligent. And when something threatens that image, even slightly, you react as if something real is being taken from you. But let's be precise. What exactly are you protecting in those moments? Your reputation? Or your ego? Because those are not the same thing. Reputation is built slowly, through consistent behavior over time. Ego reacts instantly. Try to defend an image in a single moment. And very often, in trying to protect your ego, you damage your reputation. Think about that. How many times have you said something just to prove a point, and later realize it weakened your position? How many times have you reacted not because it was necessary, but because silence felt uncomfortable? Let me ask you another question. If someone recorded your reactions over the past 30 days, every tone shift, every defensive response, every unnecessary reply, what pattern would they see? Control or compulsion? Because patterns don't lie. They reveal what is actually governing your behavior. Now look forward. 5 years from now, if nothing changes, if you continue reacting at the same speed, with the same patterns, what does that do to your relationships? To your credibility? To your internal state? Do you become more respected? Or just more predictable? More stable? Or just more exhausted? Because this is not static. Reactivity compounds. Each small reaction trains the next one. Each moment you fail to pause makes the next pause harder. And eventually, you don't even notice the absence of control. You just call it who you are. But it isn't who you are. It is what you have practiced. And anything practiced can be changed. The question is whether you are willing to see it clearly, without justification, without softening it, without telling yourself that this is just how people are. Because it isn't. Some people have trained themselves to pause, to observe, to choose. And as a result, they move through the same world with far less friction, less regret, less internal noise, more control. So here is the final question you need to sit with. Not answer quickly, not intellectually, but honestly. Are you living as someone who chooses their responses, or as someone who simply experiences them after they happen. There is a difference, and that difference shapes everything that follows. Look around carefully. You are living in a system that profits from your reactivity. Every notification is designed to pull you. Every headline is engineered to provoke you. Every platform is optimized to keep you emotionally engaged, not mentally clear. Because an emotional mind is an impulsive mind, and an impulsive mind is easy to control. So if you do nothing, if you continue reacting the way you always have, you are not staying the same. You are declining. Your attention becomes weaker. Your responses become faster. Your emotional baseline becomes more unstable. And over time, this doesn't just affect how you feel. It affects how you're perceived. Less composed, less reliable, less in control. Let me ask you one final question before we close. If someone studied your behavior under pressure, would they see a person who leads themselves or someone who can be led, triggered, redirected, and destabilized by external noise? Because in a world that constantly pushes for your reaction, the ability to pause is no longer a soft skill. It is a form of defense. If you are ready to stop being an emotional puppet for the world, then don't treat this as content. Treat it as a standard. Subscribe only if you are willing to practice this. Not once, not when it's easy, but when it matters. Because the pause is not theory. It is a decision you make in real time.